3 months ago, I built this bird bathing pond to try to give some of the wildlife on my property a place to drink and bathe during the hot, dry summer months. I've had trail cameras monitoring this area ever since, so it's time to see what's been showing up and to give an update on how the pond's doing. When I was first building this, I mentioned that we were in a dry period. I noticed that a lot of the small pools on the property were drying up, so I thought it was the perfect time to start building a bathing pond. Well, funny enough, 3 days after finishing the majority of the build, the temperatures just plummeted from high 20s to low 10s, and we had 2 of the wettest weeks that we've had all year. All of these ditches that were dry for weeks were now flowing beautifully with fresh rainwater. I mean, you can't help but laugh at the poor timing of it all. So needless to say, we weren't off to the best start. We were catching the tail end of a few eastern storms that brought in high wind and thunderstorms, which eventually caused a minor issue at the pond: water loss. And not in the way that you might think, like a hole leaking water, but rather through power outages, which is one of the downsides of using this pump to create the waterfalls. In the last video, a lot of you were asking how this system actually works. So there's a pump in the bottom pool that brings water through this tube that I tried my best to bury under the rocks so you don't see it. And that brings water all the way up to the top waterfall. As the water fills the top pool, that eventually overflows and begins to fill the one below it, and so on until it fills the very last pool, where the cycle can start over again. However, if the pump turns off, then the cycle can't continue, and any extra water in the pools will flow into the bottom one, where it then overflows and exits the low spot into the ditch. And if this happens often enough, the bottom pool could run dry since there's not enough water in the system. Because of the storms moving through, this did happen a bit just because our power kept cutting in and out. So just as a precaution, I would unplug the pump for a few days here and there whenever we were expecting some of these storms. And although it's a minor inconvenience, there's not really any downside to temporarily unplugging the pump. These pools still hold water just like a regular bird bath or pond would, so the wildlife can still use it no problem. Besides that, everything else has been running smoothly. There hasn't been any blocks or leaks to deal with. One thing I was concerned about was how the rocks and mossy area would hold up structurally. During the first couple of weeks though, the wildlife definitely put this area through its paces. As you'd expect during these cold and rainy 2 weeks, the pond from a bird perspective was pretty quiet, but we were getting frequent visits from some mammals like the baby foxes, raccoons, and skunks. All of which were great at testing and breaking in the new pond. The foxes specifically put my mind at ease when it came to whether or not the rocks would hold up. They're the biggest animal I'm expecting to use the pond, so the fact that they can run all around the rocks without any issues makes me pretty confident that they'll hold up long term. This mother raccoon and her 3 babies were also a pretty good test. Raccoons will naturally forage in water like this, so it was good to see that they were able to get in and out without any issues. After looking through the footage, I noticed that they only went into the water on the days when the pump was off, so I'm not sure if that's just a coincidence or if they don't like going into flowing water. I know I've heard that deer prefer visiting stagnant watering holes since they're usually quieter, making it kind of easier for them to pick up any potential predators around. But whether or not it's true, it's still interesting how having the pump on or off could potentially attract different species. If you remember the small bird bath I built, that one has a constant flow of water and the raccoons haven't used that one either, even though they have been around and inspected it. But raccoons aside, the smaller one has attracted a good variety of mammals: chipmunks, red squirrels, skunks, groundhogs, and of course the red foxes. Seems like the groundhogs and skunks are having a bit of trouble reaching the water, so next year I'd like to dig a small hole and drop this bird bath about a foot or so just to get it a little bit closer to ground level. But besides that, there's honestly not a whole lot that I would change about this setup. It's simple, it's portable, doesn't take up much space, and probably most importantly, it works. At the bigger pond, however, there's a small list of things I want to update over the next year or so. At this point, we were already in September, and since the snow was only about 2 months away, actually less than 2 months away in our area, I knew I'd have to take out the pump and waterfall by probably November, so I didn't want to go too crazy with upgrading the area. I'll probably leave that until next spring. But for this year, I did collect a few mossy rocks to incorporate around the pond, as well as some more branches and perches for birds to use as they're coming down to the water. It's always good to have multiple perches set up just so the birds can take whatever path they feel safest down to the water. I also took a few plants and mats of vegetation from our bigger pond and temporarily dispersed them in the different pools. I designed this bathing pond with the idea that the birds would pretty much only use the middle section since the edges are less steep and it's easier for them to see if there's any predators around. So since the top and bottom pool aren't used as often and it's not quite as safe, I think next year what I'll do is I'll kind of use it as a plant nursery for native aquatic plants. I can grow them in these 2 pools. They'll help uptake nutrients and provide some habitat. And when they're ready, I can just pick them up, relocate them, and bring them to some of our other ponds or wet spaces on the property. In terms of vegetation, an oversight that I had with this build is the impact the wildlife would have on the moss. I harvested this towards the edges of a logged forest, so it wasn't doing too great to begin with. I was kind of hoping I could help it rebound around the pond. But it hasn't had a whole lot of time to settle. First of all, we have the fox kits, which would run around and wrestle all over it. Secondly, there's skunks that are tearing it up, either looking for grubs or maybe even slugs since there's a lot of them around the moss. And lastly, there's a pair of turkeys that showed up and they've been just scratching and moving it all around while foraging. So I think the moss may become patchy in some areas, but I can't really complain. I mean, I built this area for wildlife, so they'll use it however they want. Take these logs, for example. I initially placed them here thinking they would be used as refuge for small amphibians. But so far, a red squirrel's been using it to survey its territory. Flickers use it to probe for insects. And a blue jay used it to aggressively remove the bristles from a woolly bear caterpillar. And when it comes to building these habitats, that's the most exciting part, not watching the caterpillar get dismantled, but seeing how the animals actually use the area after it's built. Even though sometimes they may disturb it, in other ways they kind of also help maintain it. The foxes are generous enough to fertilize the soil, free of charge of course. The turkeys graze and remove any plants poking through the moss, which keeps the surrounding area free of tall vegetation. And raccoons monitor the cameras, making sure they're properly set up, level, and ready to catch the action. Once we hit mid-September, the weather finally started to warm up again. In the summer after the nesting season, it's fairly common in the north to have a quiet stretch where there aren't many birds around. It usually picks up again once they start moving through in the fall migration. But despite the lack of birds, we did get our first raptor. Take a look on the very left of the screen. There's a sharp-shinned hawk sitting on the rocks, and this is another situation where you just can't help but laugh. If the camera was over an inch or two, it would have been clear in the frame, but all we got was this brief shot of its tail, so I'm not sure if it tried to bathe or catch a bird, but either way, I'm really happy with the sighting. There are also a ton of clips of red squirrels, and I know for some people their constant triggering of the trail cameras can be a bit of a nuisance, but in this situation it actually worked out really well. The cameras sometimes have trouble picking up smaller birds, but there were times where a red squirrel would trigger the camera, and in the background you see some songbirds using the pond. This made it a little easier to monitor the smaller species that we're visiting, like the goldfinches. Goldfinches are one of the last songbirds to breed in the summer, so they're usually the most abundant bird in the area around this quieter period. These were the last baby birds that I saw for the year. They would perch in the pines above the pond and scream at the adults until they brought them some food. I also saw a group of 11 juvenile turkeys coming around. I first saw them a couple of months before feeding under our apple tree with 2 adult female turkeys. But now they're old enough and they've separated from the adults and they tend to visit about once every 2 weeks. Which is nowhere near as often as these 2 gobblers would show up. If you watched the last trail camera update, I mentioned how we've had these 2 male turkeys hanging around the front of our property the past few months. They're here every day and they basically do this constant loop where they visit our apple trees to feed on the fallen fruit. Then they make their way over to our driveway to get some grit. And finally, they make their way to the bird bath to grab a drink. And honestly, I didn't think they would use the pond that much, but every day we've had anywhere between 10 and 15 clips of them, sometimes even more. So needless to say, they're living like kings around here, even though the red foxes are constantly watching them, just dreaming of the feast they could have if they caught one, but overall, it really doesn't seem to be bothering them too much. Every week I'd sit at the pond for about a day to try to film some of the birds, but it was very slow. Like the visits were just so few and far between, not just at the pond, but throughout the property in general. I was really hoping we'd have this high volume of birds moving through for the fall migration like we did in the spring. In May, there were some days where we'd have a few hundred juncos, blackbirds, and grackles just in our yard. But this fall was nothing like that. Probably the most interesting sighting we had during autumn was this clip of a fisher running around, and this is the closest we've seen them to the house. But besides that, during the last month, the pond was mostly used by the regulars, the turkeys, red squirrels, blue jays, and red foxes. I recently removed the pump and waterfall for the winter. I'll probably put out a small heated bird bath like I did last year so the birds still have a place to get a drink. Overall, I think we had some pretty interesting sightings so far. I'll be curious to see if we can get some more bird activity during the spring migration. But for now, the pond is frozen over and some of the animals are coming to grab their last drink here before we settle into the long winter ahead.